In the book of Genesis. Also began our annual cycle of studying in the Torah. And last week we ended last week talking about Noah and the fall, what came before God established redemption at that point with the fall. And we ended there. So let's pick it up from where we left off last week. We had the fall of man, and together with that, of course, the fall of the angels. Which came first? Likely the fall of the angels, no doubt, because Satan, who led the angels into rebellion, initiated the fall with Eve, and then, of course, it was confirmed or ratified with Adam. And so we saw that last week that the fall was really exemplified clearly in Cain. And from Cain it developed because Cain established civilization. And civilization in the fallen context is not favorable for the kingdom of God. And so we saw that Cain, because of his sin and refusal to trust God, sin proliferated in the world, rebellion became widespread. A civilization of rebellion came into existence, and then, of course, the angels who fell from grace compound the whole matter with rebellion of the worst kind and sin of the worst kind. And that brought things to a point where God said that he would put an end to that particular civilization. And he did. So that's where we ended up last week. Tonight we're going to look at 4 areas of interest in tonight's Torah portion. Tonight's Torah portion is simply named Noah. In Hebrew, Noach. But in Noah is the portion tonight, Genesis chapter 6, verse 9 to 11:32, tonight's Torah portion. So we're going to look at four areas of interest in tonight's Torah portion. The first area of interest we're going to consider is Noah himself. What do we know about Noah? Well, he was a son of Seth. He was a descendant of Seth. He was born when that fallen creation was about 400 years old at the time, maybe. So he was born well after the initiation of the fall with Cain, and not the initiation of the fall with Satan, but the proliferation of the fall with Cain. But he was born into a fallen existence, and he existed at the time when things were at its worst. But it ended last week, the Torah portion ended last week in verse 8 of chapter 6, where it simply says, "But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." So tonight we're going to look into Noah's position before God. What was it about Noah that was favorable in God's eyes? And so we'll discover that later on tonight. So Noah was righteous. That's what tonight's Torah portion begins with, that Noah was righteous before God. So let's read that in chapter 6 of Genesis, verse 9. "These are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in all his ways. Noah walked with God." So keep in mind that final sentence, that Noah walked with God. We'll come back to that later tonight. Also, another area of interest in tonight's Torah portion has to do, of course, with the flood. Right? God brought a flood which destroyed civilization and all of creation at the time, with the exception of Noah, his sons, and their wives. So how many souls are there? 8 souls. And God preserved these 8 souls for the purpose of repopulation. That's one of the things he said directly to Noah and his sons, to repopulate, to spread out and be fruitful. Now the flood was to destroy not all of God's creation, but to halt the progress of evil. Right? But that civilization had to be stopped. Creation wasn't destroyed. The earth was not destroyed with the flood. The earth continued, and just a mere 40 days after the flood was initiated, the earth began to sprout, and life was was once again part of the human existence. But he certainly stopped the progress of evil, destroyed it for that time. But we know that evil continued to exist in the hearts of man. Now, in regards to the flood, there were 40 days of rain, 40 days and 40 nights of non-stop rain. It said that the reservoir or the storehouses of water that were beneath in the earth were released. And the waters above were also released. And so you had a deluge from heaven and earth. So many of us, we believe that in the original creation, in the Garden of Eden, there was a very thick, dense layer of water or vapor that existed right about where our stratosphere is today. So we have what's called a stratosphere. What is the purpose of the stratosphere? No one knows, really. We know that it's there. The atmosphere has function and purpose. The stratosphere, we don't really know what it's there for, but we know that there's something there, a layer between space and the atmosphere. Now, it is believed, and I subscribe to this, that where the stratosphere is where this very dense layer of vapor existed. And some people would speculate further to say that that water barrier or the vapor, the layer of vapor, was there to block out UV rays, ultraviolet rays, which are harmful. And of course, we discussed this at length in the Zemar class. It is believed that part of the process of shortening the lifespan of humans had to do with the removal of that barrier. Because, of course, water is perhaps the most easily accessible, I should say, protection from radiation, ultraviolet rays. And so we believe that that layer protected man from harmful radiation from the sun. Once that was removed, of course, we see an almost immediate lessening of the lifespan. So it coordinates. In fact, we read it last week, I think. God said that he would not strive with man, but that he would live to 120 years, maximum 120 years. Of course, since the flood, there's been people who have lived beyond 120, few, not many, but few people have lived beyond 120. So 120 is sort of a threshold. It's not an average, a mean average lifespan, by no means. The mean average lifespan, I think it's about 70 years old. If I'm not mistaken, today, the mean average lifespan is about 72 years to be exact. It hasn't always been this way throughout history. In fact, 100 years ago, the average lifespan would have been about maybe 65 or 60 years old. And further back you go is the left life. But nevertheless, there's a threshold of 120. Now, this was pronounced by God at the very time he was considering removing this barrier, what's called in the Bible the expanse. The expanse, again, was beyond the barrier, but once he removed this, again, this is all hypothetical. It's not, you can't prove it from the Bible, but it fits in even in a scientific context. It does fit in. There's no scientist that will pursue this for proof, but this is what I believe. At any rate, so there was a vast amount of water, H2O, in vapor form or whatever, that existed around the entire sphere of the earth. Just a thick layer of water. God simply released what was holding it back, and it fell to the earth. It took 40 days for it to fall to the earth, and it created the flood. But not just that, according to what we see concerning the flood, water came up from the earth as well. Now, just about every ancient culture has stories, narratives concerning a worldwide flood. They all do. And on top of that, there is ample evidence, geographical evidence, that there has been, at some point in history, a very intense period of flooding. So the story of the flood, I don't find it necessary to try and validate it, but it's always interesting to know that there's so much evidence for a global flood, and yet we tend to look past it. Why do we look past it? We, I mean humanity. the scientific community, academia. Why do we look past it? Because it's so incredibly passé and biblical. It's not something that we would even consider. But yet, so much evidence is there, but we won't consider it. Nevertheless, the flood, God sent the flood. Now, why did he send the flood? To destroy life, yes. To prevent evil is more like it. To hold back evil. And in the process, he also shortened the lifespan of the average man. So what does shortening the lifespan has to do with culling or holding back evil? How did he prevent evil from advancing? By shortening the lifespan of humanity. Right. It's very simple. It's not a hard deduction at all. It's simple. If a man lives to 900 years old, he's much more capable of evil than someone who lives to 70 years old or 120. In this fallen state, without being able to live for 1,000 years, we degenerate much quicker. By the age of 60 or 65, or maybe at max 70, you're beginning to slow down physiologically. And in some cases, otherwise as well. You're beginning to slow right down. So your capacity, well, our capacity for evil, really comes to a zenith right about at the age of 55. Now, men beyond 55 are certainly capable of evil if they're incredibly determined. But nevertheless, our seemingly our innate fallen tendency to do evil comes to a threshold or a zenith right about at the age of 55 to 60. And we slow right down. Now, the man before the flood, that zenith would be reached at 700, 800, or whatever. So they were much more capable of extended evil than we are. So in holding back, or in shortening the lifespan, God held back evil tremendously. So, I mean, just think of who can we, I don't want to judge any person, but who can we consider to be an evil person? Biden. Biden has reached his zenith a long time ago. He's just a frame, a shell of an evil man. So let's just say hypothetically, okay, so Hitler, all right? Hitler's reign of evil lasted about 15 years, maybe, max, when the Nazi Party came into being and the brown shirts took over the streets of Germany and Australia, about 15 years before he died. Now, had Hitler lived to 700 years or 900 years, how much more evil would he have been capable of? So you see, God, in his wisdom, removed that capacity from humanity by shortening man's lifespan. And it did hold back evil significantly. Evil had built to such a crescendo. And the word evil there is sort of subjective. It depends on your view of what's good and what's bad. But the word that's used in the Bible for evil, in this text, actually, for evil is ra, the Hebrew word ra, which really, not exclusively, but points to selfishness. So when you consider the evil that existed during the time of Noah, for about 1,000 years, roughly, that evil had existed. It was all about the self-orientation being widely expressed in humanity. And that's what brought about this horrible condition. Now, it's taken us, now what? Since the flood, about 5,000 years, 4,500 years since the flood. It's taken us this long to come to a place where we can even begin to come close to the evil that existed before the flood. So God brought that flood for good reason. Evil had got to its highest extent. And the only thing he could have done, or the only thing he determined to do, I should say, he could have done many things, but the only thing he determined to do, or the thing he determined to do, was to put an end to it and bring about a new beginning. Now, that's the second point of interest. The third point of interest is the generations that followed after Noah, after the flood, after the ark landed on Mount Ararat. We're talking about the generations of Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. What do we know? We know that he had 3 sons, and they had wives, and they were the progenitor of all civilization. So each of us here, we go back to that nucleus that God had provided for. We all are children of Noah and his wife. We have to assume that his wife was also of the children of Seth, that she was righteous as well. Now, we don't know about the wives of Japheth, Ham, or Shem, but in the seed of Noah was the potential for evil, because very shortly after the ark landed on Mount Ararat and the sons of Noah began to repopulate the earth, we come to the 4th point of interest for tonight, which is Babel. So, the generations of the sons of Noah were fruitful, and in that sense they were obedient to God's command, which was to be fruitful and to multiply. So we see in Genesis chapter 8, 7, 8, 9, and 10, actually it's 9, 10, and 11, that the generations of the sons of Noah were extremely prolific. They began to have children and children and children, and it was great. But in a very short space of time, the space of time is actually somewhere about 300 or 400 years. That's the best estimate I can give. About 300 or 400 years. In that short space of time, we see at Babel the ascension of evil, or I should say the descension of evil once again. Nothing like what existed before the flood. Nothing like it in any way at all. But Nimrod, we all know the story of Nimrod. Nimrod was a mighty hunter before God. Now, there are people that read a lot into that text, that he was a giant, he was like a Nephilim. Some people confuse the Nephilim with the giants. The words are different. The word Nephilim does not mean giant. The word Nephilim simply means one fallen or the fallen ones. Nephilim, plural. Nephilim, the fallen ones. That's all it means. I usually attribute the Nephilim to be the fallen angels, the ones who fell. They had relationships with the daughters of man, and that union, that unholy union, gave us the men of renown, the men of old. These are actually creatures. They're not humans. They were not humans. They were amalgamated beings. But they were great men. They were, in many cases, they were the giants. They were the men that were not actually men. They were, again, an amalgamated form of humanity. Never created by God. They were not God's creation. They were the sons of the fallen angels, the sons of the Nephilim. And that's my position. I know people have different opinions about that. We're not going to debate it. But nevertheless, we see very quickly that evil begins to ascend. And Nimrod is simply a son of Cush. Who was Cush? He was the son of Ham. So Cush, son of Ham, gave birth to Nimrod. Now, Nimrod was not his name. Nimrod is a Hebrew word, and his name, as far as we can tell, was Gilgamesh, probably something else. The Epic of Gilgamesh is most people agree, the Epic of Gilgamesh is about Nimrod and his reign over the mighty Sumerian Empire. Now, the word Sumer is interesting because the word Sumer is the word for Cush's actual name. So Cush, his actual name in that language, whatever that language was, or whatever that language became, was Sumer. And Sumer had a son. His son was Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh was this great, powerful king. He was larger than life. He was a large being. The depictions, the stone carving depictions that we have of Gilgamesh, again, who we believe to be Nimrod, is a man probably standing at about 8 feet, 7.5 or 8 feet. Large man. And very strong, very muscular. You know, in the ancient world, men build muscles without gyms. You know that, right? There are so many depictions of ancient warriors and soldiers and men in general, and they're extremely muscular. Why? And there wasn't a LA Fitness anywhere around. There wasn't any There wasn't any steroids, high-protein drinks, or even weights that you can grab a hold of and build muscles with. No, men of old, they worked hard. They trained hard. You know, in the ancient world, martial arts was a common thing. The warriors of old trained very hard in martial arts. Not what we know as martial arts. So the Nimrod was a warrior, incredible warrior. He was such a profound and prolific warrior that he had captured the entire world. A great king, powerful, mighty hunter before God, a mighty one before God. This Nimrod will go on to work to establish a global union. A global union. So, what can we say about Nimrod? No question, Nimrod or Gilgamesh was inspired by the evil one. Satan, after only 40 days of a flood, Satan's kingdom, which was that antediluvian civilization, that pre-flood civilization, Satan's kingdom was decimated in just 40 days. Now, I have a theory that I'm going to share with you quickly, and my theory is that before the flood, Satan, the fallen angel, Satan and his followers, his minion of angels, were physically on the earth. They were able to manifest physically on the earth. Now, that's different than what some people believe, but I believe the fallen angels literally walked the earth, and hence they took wives for themselves. Some people compare the taking of wives by the fallen angels to something along the lines that happened with Mary. I reject it. I don't believe it at all. In fact, I find it disturbing because God created that reality with Mary and the Holy Spirit. I don't think the angels would have been able to copy it or to carry it out themselves. That's my opinion. I believe they were physically on the earth. They walked the earth. Now, it's my belief that, taken from the book of Enoch, and I'm not teaching necessarily from the book of Enoch, I'm not going to quote the book of Enoch, but my supposition taken from the book of Enoch is, according to the book of Enoch, they were chained up. These fallen angels, God determined at some point that they should be chained up and thrown into a prison. And they petitioned. In fact, the angels took Enoch to see them in the spirit. And Enoch looked upon them, the chained up ones, and they asked Enoch to intercede for them. And he went to God and said, God, these chained up angels wanted me to come before you. And God said, no, don't even try it. There's no redemption for them. And Enoch went back to the fallen angels who were all chained up and said to them, there's no redemption for you. This is your lot for all eternity. Now, what did Enoch experience? Enoch experienced, first of all, he lived before the fall. He lived while these fallen angels were on the earth. He probably witnessed with his own eyes these fallen angels carrying out their abominations before God. He was taken into the spirit, and God showed him a time when these angels would be locked away. And God actually took him into the future to interact with these angels, which would have come into existence after the fall. You see, once you are taken out of this physical realm where time and space is actually a confinement, you're taken into the spirit realm, and God can put you in the future, He can put you in the past, He can do anything with you if you're in that place. In fact, I believe that God took him into that heavenly realm in order to show him things that would come. Take him to places where he can witness even the future. And if you study any of the prophets, you find the very same reality in the prophets as well. This was the case with John in the book of Revelation, right? He was taken into the throne room of God, into the heavenly realm, and taken to the place where he can see future events, things that will occur in the future. So he literally was taken into the future. Now that's my point. So I believe that Satan and his minion were very active, physically active and directly active in the earth before the flood. Following the flood, I believe that they were completely locked away. And so, by what means would they be able to control humanity once again? In other words, by what means did Satan, these fallen angels, manage to gain control over Nimrod and his kingdom? How did they do it if they were physically locked away? Well, their spirits were able to roam the earth. In other words, physically they're locked away. They're spiritual beings. And the angels are created sort of like in the same image of God. The Bible doesn't say that specifically, but we know what Jesus said, that we are created a little lower than the angels. That's what he said. And we are created in the image of God, body, soul, and spirit. So these angels have a like manner of creation. So Satan and his angels were able to roam, even though their body was locked away, they were able to roam the earth spiritually. I hope that's not too far out there for you. So since the flood, following the flood, Satan and his angels has been roaming the earth spiritually, unable to physically manifest in order to carry about evil once again. Now, evil has not been successful for them as it was before the flood. In other words, there is a gradual buildup to where things will become once again in such a way, in such a condition that God would have to destroy it. And that's where we're approaching today. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. But let's talk about Babel. So what was Babel all about? Babel was the devil's attempt to bring about evil as it existed before the flood. That's what Babel was really all about. Satan probably said to his minion, trapped away in this dungeon somewhere, that our work has not come to an end. We are locked away, but we're going to continue to move towards rebellion against God. What we're going to do is we're going to get out there in spirit, and we're going to lead man who desire to be powerful, man who desire to attain a lot, man who want to rule, will move in their hearts and embolden them even more, and through those men we will manifest evil in the earth. In other words, we're not able to do it directly, but we will do it through man. You see, the devil is not able to manifest in any form except through man. And that's what they determined to do at Babel. They found Nimrod a likely candidate, a willing candidate, and all of his men with him, and they established a kingdom that was to rival God. And that's what the Tower of Babel was, wasn't it? To build a tower that will enter into heaven. In other words, God, we don't need to come before you. We will build something that will come to you. We will be like God ourselves. Now, this was the condition of Satan, right? Lucifer. We saw it in Ezekiel chapter 28 when we studied it, in Zamach, and I'm sure you all studied it, that Satan wanted to be like God. Isaiah chapter 14, Ezekiel chapter 28. He wanted to ascend, and so the building of the ziggurat, or the tower, was for that purpose. Now, was there buildings of towers and so on before the flood? Yeah. Absolutely there were. And here's another theory, since I'm throwing out theories. Here's another theory for you. I believe that the pyramids that we see throughout the world, and they're not just pyramids in Egypt. There are 3 pyramids in Egypt. One of them is a sizable pyramid, but there are larger pyramids, or remains of larger pyramids around the world. There's a pyramid in Central America, the remains of it anyway, that dates back ancient times, that's larger than the Great Pyramid by 3 or 4 times. There's the remains of a pyramid in China that's larger than the Great Pyramid by 6 or 7 times. So, and they're typically made with very large stones that even today humanity will have a hard time moving, even today. So here's what I believe. I believe in the ancient world, with the men of renown, the great men, the giants, they were inspired by the fallen angels and built temples or pyramids, places of worship, where Satan would be at the pinnacle of that worship, the pinnacle of that system of worship. That's where he would be, and that's why every pyramid has a pinnacle. You see, every pyramid, I believe, that was built before the flood is designed to epitomize or to glorify Satan's rule over humanity. He stands at he is the capstone. He is the high point of this structure where he's above, all of humanity is below. And so I believe that all of the pyramids, except some of the pyramids of Central America, which clearly was built after the flood, but there are pyramids in Central America, by the way, folks, that predates 2,000 years ago. Some of the pyramids in Central America were built 1,500 years ago, and they're not really pyramids, they're temples, but they look like pyramids. Now, get back to the point. Following the flood, these pyramids or these ziggurats, these temples that were being built by man with bricks, right? What did Nimrod say? And we're going to read this here in a moment. Come, let us make bricks so that we can build a temple. The point is, they did not have the availability of the men of old, the giants. And they didn't have the cooperation and the involvement of the fallen angels and their sons to build these large structures. They were gone. They were physically off the earth. So they determined that what should we do? We build bricks. And from that point going forward, every temple that was built with bricks, because they were unable to move the colossal stones that the former temples were built with. Again, I'm saying that it was the men of renown, the so-called giants, that built the temples before the flood. Not Machu Picchu, Endepi Tepe, the pyramids, all of these massive structures built with stones that are colossal, and they're built in ways that even today we cannot engineer their construction. The fallen angels did it together with their sons. All right, that's my position. So following the flood, they wanted to spur evil again. They wanted to bring evil into existence again, bring about the worship of Satan. How are we going to build a temple? Well, it's simple. Build bricks. We don't have the help of the fallen ones. We'll build bricks. And that's what Nimrod determined to do. To put together a massive, massive project where he would have hundreds and thousands of people making bricks. He had a huge production line. Some were building bricks, some were transporting, some were mashing the fabric or the plant that's used for the brick. And he had a wonderful production thing going, but all of it was for the purpose of building a tower that will rival God, that will poke God in the face and say, we are still here to conduct evil. And this is why God destroyed it. Because in that place of, that incredible place that Nimrod had taken humanity for that short space of time, where they were all working in unison for the purpose of this temple, in that place, God determined that he would destroy this effort. But he knew, of course, that there would be yet another effort at bringing about a second Babel. So let's read about Nimrod's Babel in Genesis chapter 11. I'm going to read 1 to 9. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used bricks for stone, and that's proof of what I'm saying right there. Instead of stone, they couldn't lift the stones. Instead of stones, they used bricks instead of stone. And they used tar for mortar. They said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So what did God say to Noah and his sons? The same ones who are saying, let us build a civilization. Let us settle down in one place. Let us build a tower so that we're not scattered. What did he say to them? To be scattered, to spread out, to populate the earth. So this statement that we see here in verse 4 is in stark contrast to God's command. It is rebellion, horrible rebellion. Just a few hundred years earlier, God said, populate the earth, spread out. Don't concentrate as it was before the flood, spread out. And they chose to do exactly the opposite and to build a finger that will poke God in his eye. That's what Babel was. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of man had built. The Lord said, behold, they are one people. They are united in this effort, right? Again, Nimrod was an incredible engineer, or he had incredible engineers working for him. And this great effort was being done in accord. And they all had the same purpose, which was to build this tower and build this civilization. And they were united in the rebellion. The Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. What does that statement mean? I am convinced he's saying that what existed before the flood can exist now, and nothing that existed before the flood would be impossible for them to do. I don't think he meant that nothing is impossible. Of course, he's pointing back to what existed before the flood. Then he says, come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. So God had to impose upon humanity what he wanted them to do by their own free will. Now, I would love to think that God would impose his will upon us when we choose not to obey him, but he does not always. Quite often, if we choose not to obey him and exercise our free will, he will allow us to go into that place of what will ultimately be wrath. But he's gracious. Even if we are called for something and we choose not to do it, not to obey him, to go against his will, he is faithful and he will get our attention. But in this case, he decides that he will force humanity, he will implement his will, which is what he did. And why would he do such a thing? Because he knew what would come if mankind was allowed to continue in this rebellion. They would attain to another place again where the solution would be destruction. And he wasn't quite ready for that just yet. One of the most important things that would have to happen before he brings about that final destruction of civilization is the cross. The cross had to happen. And it had to happen in a very certain context, in a very particular context. I'm talking about in the context of the people of Israel. God had determined to bring about a people for redemption. And of that people for redemption, he would bring the promised one who would in fact atone for all of God's redemption. So God had, in his timeline, a determination to work this out. So he did not destroy civilization then. He did not allow civilization at Babel to come to the place where he would destroy it. Certain things had to happen, right? And that timeline for redemption is well extended to today. What I mean is, most of the steps necessary for God's timeline to come to fruition is complete. Today, where we are today. From my perspective, knowing the Bible, there are very few things that are lacking in God's work of redemption. So we're at the point where God would once again be willing, or should I say, apt to bring about that final destruction of civilization. There will be another one in the millennial kingdom, but you see, what we're facing is the destruction of Babel or Babylon. The Bible says Babel, it's Babylon, right? What we're facing right now is God's basically saying, okay, now is the time for me to allow humanity under the control of the demonic realm to come to that place of unity once again. In other words, this is the time. Man will unite. Man will build a tower, not a physical tower, but a symbolic tower. And that tower is being built. The United Nations and all of the globalist organizations are proclaiming that such a thing is being built. We're providing a way to provide peace for man. We are going to be our own gods. And that was the ambition of Nimrod. Nimrod became worshipped as a god following the destruction of Babel. His son and his wife, they all became gods who were worshipped in the ancient world. So the point of Babel is to elevate man to the statehood of God. And that's what man has been driven to do. And so here we are today. We're seeing today a world system, a tower that's being built, and it's taken the position that we are going to attain to Godship over humanity. That's what these men are actually interested in, to become gods. Now, I'm not going to go too far into that. And the United Nations, the globalists, this whole effort is, in their own minds, a messianic type effort that will bring peace, that will bring unity to humanity. And it will, for a very short period of time. There will be something like unity. There will be something like peace. But it will not be real unity. It will not be the unity that we can experience in the Holy Spirit. It's not going to be peace. It's going to be something like peace. It's going to be peace that's completely a facade. This would be allowed to exist for a while, and then God will ultimately put an end to it, as he put an end to Nimrod's Babel. All right? So the Lord scattered them from abroad and over the face of the whole earth and stopped them from building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel. Why Babel? Because their languages were confused. Because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole land, the whole earth. So God had to do what they themselves would not do. All right. Now, let's get back to Noah. I want to end with considering Noah. So Noah witnessed the incredible evil that existed before the flood. He lived in it. Probably lived apart from it, separate from it, but he lived in the midst of it. I don't think Noah would have been a part of civilization before the flood. I think he would have lived separate from civilization, and there's probably some evidence of that. Now, what happened? Noah, it says, walked with God. That's what we read earlier in verse 9. Noah walked with God. That's a very unique statement that we find in the book of Genesis. Prior to the flood, only two men walked with God. And who were those two men? Enoch and Noah. They walked with God. Now we have to examine what that means. What does it mean to walk with God? Did they walk with God because they were holy and blameless and they were righteous? Is that what gave them the attribute of walking with God? They were good men, they were righteous, they were holy men. Certainly we can say that. But what led to their righteousness? What led to their holiness? What led to them being able to walk with God? The attribute of walking with God begins somewhere, with something. And I want to say to you, it begins with faith. And what is faith? Faith is now a gift from God and has always been a gift from God. God gives faith to humanity. What we do with it will determine how our righteousness would pan out. So that's what we're going to look at right here. That Noah was righteous, not because he was innately better than the other men around him, and neither was Enoch. Enoch wasn't righteous, didn't walk with God because he was somehow a better cut of a human being than the other humans around. No, he had faith. God gave him faith, as he would have with many other men of that time. What Enoch did with it is what is important. Enoch took the gift of faith that God gave him, and he embraced it, and he appropriated it in his life. He actively believed and worked towards the fulfillment of the word that God gave him. And this is the same with Noah. Now, following Noah and following the flood, there are other characters in the Bible who walk by faith. And of course, Abraham is the most notable following the flood who walked by faith. Could we say that Judah, at some point in his life, began to walk by faith? Absolutely. After the situation with Tamar, he rejoins the clans of Israel and he is upright before God. So no doubt there was a time when God spoke to Judah and he responded, and developed faith, righteousness by faith. But what about Joseph? Do you think Joseph was righteous by faith? What do you think? Of course he was. Of course Joseph was righteous by faith. His time in prison, his time at Potiphar's house, his time at the right hand of Pharaoh, faith was active in his life, had to be. God was speaking to him, and he obeyed God as he heard. And so it doesn't say specifically that Joseph was a tremendous man of faith, but he must have been. He had to be. So we have Abraham, who is the next character we see in the Bible following the flood, who walks with God. Was his walk perfect? No. No. He had shortcomings like any of us. I would dare to say that Enoch or Noah had shortcomings. The Bible does not reveal them, but they were men. They were men who would have had the same struggles to obey God, to walk in faith as any other human being. But the Bible portrays them as men, righteous men, who walked by faith. They walked with God, and that's the point. To walk with God, another way of saying walking with God is to walk by faith. So we want to understand what it is to walk by faith. And this is very important, because the truth is, this defines who we are as followers, disciples of Yeshua. One of the things that Jesus emphasized the most as he taught his disciples and in discipling his disciples was faith. No surprise, right? When you consider his overall message to his disciples, much of it, I should say, was centered on the reality of faith for righteousness. And Jesus lived it for all of us to see. He lived it. He practiced it. He perfected it. He is the author and the perfecter of our faith. But he came in the flesh to teach us the way of faith, the way of emunah, hearing from God and obeying and executing, therefore, righteousness. Let's go to the book of Hebrews. We're going to read in Hebrews chapter 11. We all know that Hebrews chapter 11 is sort of the chapter of faith, the hall of faith, as some people refer to it. Now we're going to read about Enoch and Noah specifically, who walked with God. In Hebrews chapter 11, I think I want to read 5 to 7. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. So what was God's word to Enoch? Believe that I will take you with me, and you will not see death in the flesh. And Enoch had some things to do to have that executed in his life. He had some righteousness to accomplish, and he accomplished that by his faith. Right? And he was not found because God took him up, for he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. How does the Bible tell us we shall please God? The following verse tells us, and without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that God is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. So, seeking God is a very important aspect of hearing from God, and therefore walking in faith. I'm going to capture it here I'm going to try to capture it in just a simple sentence. If you want to be pleasing to God, if you want God's righteousness in your life, the righteousness that comes by faith, you should seek him fully and believe that he will speak to you. And when he does, when you hear his voice, act upon it. Actuate the faith. And boy, that's the surest way to please God and to attain to righteousness. To hear his voice, obey his voice, execute his direction, and walk in faith. Attain to righteousness. That's how it happens. Now let's read about Noah. By faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, this is critical, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world, and because an heir of righteousness, become, an heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. Let's read that again. And became, an heir of the righteousness, which is according to faith. Paul speaks about in Romans chapter 5, the righteousness that comes by faith. You see, the writer of the book of Hebrews is drawing reference to the means by which Noah and Enoch and Abraham became righteous. How did Abraham become righteous? How did he become just before God? By his faith. He believed the word of God. Did Abraham seek God? You see, it begins with the seeking process. We must seek his face. And when we seek his face, we do it with a full anticipation that he will speak to me. Yes, the God of the universe, the great creator of all, will bow down and speak to me. You seek him on that level, with that conviction, with that belief. And I want to say that I am sure, I feel really sure, that he will correspond with you. He will speak to you. He is faithful. If we approach him, if we seek him humbly, if we come before him, draw close to me, God says, and I will in turn draw close to you. If God is close to you, you're walking with him. You see? If you want to walk with God, like Enoch and Noah did, draw near to him, seek him, believe that he will give you instructions for your righteousness. And when you hear him, and you will, obey him perfectly. Obey him perfectly. Block out all of the other voices. Sometimes we get wrapped up in Christian radio. Is there Christian radio anymore? No, sometimes we get all tied up in Christian podcasts and webcasts and Christian TV and YouTube Christianity and all these things. And we're listening to so many voices. But is it possible, with all of the voices that are out there, God is not really speaking? Because God wants to speak to us on a very intimate level. He wants to speak to me and you at the very core of our being. God knows what's essential in our lives. The preacher on the radio, or on the podcast, really does not. I'm not saying God can't use him, but if you want God's very specific direction for your life, seek him. Draw near to him. Press in. Give yourself a period of time to just press into him and believe with everything that he will speak to you. And when he does, you obey, and wonderful things will happen in your life. In the age to come, there's going to be a giant scroll or a book or JPEG or something that will have those of faith by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions. Like in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. I think 6 or 8 characters are listed there, people of faith in the Bible. In the age to come, there's going to be a list of people who walked by faith, who walked with God. We want to be on that list. We can be on that list. We absolutely can be. We can have the faith, we can have the boldness of conviction to believe that we will be on that list in the age to come. The ultimate scroll of those of faith. Millions and millions of humans will be on that list. I don't plan to make it big in this life, you can tell. But I do plan to be on that list, on that scroll. My name is there. And I will do nothing to have it erased. I will continue to hear and obey. I will block out all of the other voices. They just bring confusion and mayhem. And I will listen to God's voice. I will believe that he will speak to me. Whenever I am in need of a word, I will say, God, speak to me. We're going to learn a new song. It's called I Surrender. And Jim and Amado will do that for us on Sunday. There's a little verse in there that says, speak to me. Jesus, speak to me. And it's powerful because the song is basically presenting the need for his word. I surrender. Speak to me. The song says, I'm desperate for your word. I'm desperate for you. And we're going to learn that song and we're going to sing it because it's appropriate to who we are. It's appropriate to who I am. I really don't consider how advanced I am as a believer. You know, it's important that your pastor be a good believer. You know, he's the pastor. He has to be developed. He has to be mature. He's the one that leads us. But I'm confessing to you right now that I need to hear his voice. I need his mercy in my life. I'm desperate for him. And the thing that I must do is the same thing that you must do. It's the same thing that Enoch did. And the same thing that Noah did. Press into him. How long did Abraham follow after God as best as he could until God established that covenant with him? How old was Abraham when the covenant was established? I think he was 80 years old. I think he was 80. He left Ur of the Chaldeans. We don't know how old he was, but I venture to say that Abraham pursued God for a long period of time. Next week we will see this. At the end of tonight's Torah portion, actually, is when Terah left Babel after Babel was destroyed and Nimrod was put down. He left Ur of the Chaldeans, went to Haran, and from Haran, Abraham came into the land. God said, go forth. Next week we'll see it. A tremendous chapter when it comes to faith. But in chapter 15, so chapter 12, God begins to interact with Abraham in 11 actually, and in 12, Lech Lecha, go forth. Abraham obeys. You see, he's walking with God. God said, go forth. Abraham obeys. Did he falter here? Yes, he faltered. Nonetheless, he begins the process of hearing and obeying. He's walking with God. He's attaining to righteousness, Abraham is. And then, that fateful night, after Abraham defeated the 4 Mesopotamian kings, what happened? God appeared to him. It's apparent that Abraham was a little concerned. He just defeated 4 Mesopotamian kings who are representing vast kingdoms in the east. And Abraham was out that night. Perhaps he couldn't sleep. And God says, Abraham, do not be afraid. And God begins to speak to Abraham. And suddenly Abraham, in that place of perhaps even desperation, he began to believe God. And Abraham said to God, who will be my heir, since Eliezer is the only one in my tent to be an heir? God says, Eliezer will not be the heir. But your son, from your seed, your offspring will be the heir. And Abraham believed God. After years of seeking God, coming to a night of desperation, he believed God. And for that nanosecond, in that nanosecond, he became righteous. And that's what the Bible tells us. Abraham became righteous. The Hebrew word is zadaka. He became a zadaka by his faith because he believed God. God then, therefore, after that, he cut the covenant with Abraham, and Abraham continued on his journey to righteousness. He had a son, Ishmael, but then he had a son, the son of promise. And so the walk of Abraham with God is clear in the book of Genesis. But I love what we see in the pre-flood civilization with Noah and Enoch. They simply heard from God, they obeyed him, and attained to righteousness. The righteousness that's of faith. That's what the writer of Hebrews said. For each of us, we have to be righteous. Each of us must be righteous. Not like the visitor we had a few weeks ago from the Messianic congregation who came into the church and told us that we're all basically fallen short of what it is to be a Messianic Jew. You don't wear tzitzit, you're not circumcised. He basically told us you're just, so we're not righteous by that standard. We're certainly not righteous by his standard. So he didn't like what I had to tell him and he left, never came back. Kind of happy about that. So, nonetheless, we are to be righteous. Not righteousness in this flesh, but righteous in regards to our faith. Hearing from God and obeying. Each of us should have a word of faith, or 2 or 3 from God, that we are walking out. If you're new in your walk, if you're young as a believer, and you haven't heard from God, I venture to say that you have, but you haven't recognized God's word for your life, I want to encourage you to seek him. Seek him. Seek him. And hear his voice. Draw close to him, and he will draw close to you. And he will speak to you. And when he does, I want to tell you how marvelous, how important that moment is when God speaks to you. When he speaks to you, answer. Respond. Do as he says. You're on your road to righteousness. You're on your road to having your name in that scroll that does exist and will exist. So, simple message, walk by faith. Walk with God. It is the wonderful opportunity that God has put before each of us. Shabbat Shalom.